So Askawi Kwasanumis Kakanupiam, greetings and welcome everyone. Natasawis Chrystal Mars Baker. As we welcome the beautiful season of fall, it is my pleasure to also welcome you to another session of our ongoing Preservation of History Lunch and Learn series. This free educational programming is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Rhode Island State Council of the Arts, the United Way, the Island Foundation, and community donors like you. We thank you for making this free educational programming possible. Each month, we have been joined by powerful voices who illuminate the ongoing significance of Indigenous history, lived experience, and the resilience of Native peoples in the face of centuries of change, challenge, and survival. This year, 2025, marks 350 years since the Great Swamp Massacre, a pivotal event in the history of the Indigenous peoples of this region, calling us to remembrance, reflection, and deeper understanding. This series continues that important conversation, and today's guest speaker will build on it as she presents Land Dispossession After King Philip's War. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to please place yourself on mute. You are welcome to share questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of today's presentation. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to today's guest speaker, Kimberly Toney. Kimberly is a citizen of the Hassanamisco Nipmuc Nation. She is the inaugural coordinating curator of Native American and Indigenous collections, jointly appointed at the John Carter Brown and John Hay Libraries at Brown University. Previously, Kim was head of Readers Services and director of Indigenous Initiatives at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. Kim regularly serves as a consultant to cultural institutions of Southern New England, and her research and personal interests include language and cultural reclamation, the intersections of Black and Indigenous histories, connecting Indigenous knowledges and practices to scholarly endeavors and land back. And so please join me in welcoming Kimberly Toney.
Thank you, Chrystal. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to start by thanking again, Chrystal, and everyone at the Tamaquag for their support and their invitation. I'm really happy to be here virtually with you all today and share some stuff that I've been working on and thinking a lot about over the last few years. So I'm going to just share my screen here. And this is where okay. So as you know, I'm going to talk to you about processes of land dispossession. I know the talk said after King Philip's War, but to set us up and get us going in a good way, I've been playing with this title and thinking again a lot about this research. So the talk is called Land Dispossession Before and After King Philip's War, Colonial Law, Native Land, and the Invention of Ownership. So just by way of introduction, as you've heard, my name is Kim. I'm an enrolled Hassanamisco Nipmuc tribal member. Nipmuc homelands are in what is now central and parts of western Massachusetts, stretching into northern Rhode Island and Connecticut as well. I've worked in special collections libraries for over 15 years now, with rare books, manuscripts, newspapers, maps, all manner of archival material. And as Chrystal mentioned, I now serve as the inaugural curator for Native and Indigenous collections at both the John Hay and the John Carter Brown libraries here on Brown's campus. And so I just have some images of those buildings. Both the libraries on the campus are the sort of only two in the library network that are free and open to the public. So I encourage you all to come visit us here someday. And also on the screen are just some collections materials from either place. And so today I want to speak with you about land dispossession, again, before, during, and after King Philip's War. Many people know the war as a conflict that officially ran from 1675 to 1676, but its violence and consequences continued for decades after. Its legacies are still very much with us today. And I also just want to offer a bit of a content warning for my talk. as histories of violence can be difficult topics, but also because I will share some primary source documents and language from those documents that can be tough to hear. So just sort of an alert to be aware and expect those things and to take care of yourselves accordingly. I'll be focusing on one particular thread, which is the role of primary documents, land deeds, petitions, proclamations, and treaties in both recording and enabling the taking of native land. These documents, like libraries and archives themselves, are not neutral. They're products of colonial systems of knowledge, law, and authority, and they continue to shape how we understand the past and how land is held into the present. And so I want to begin also with a concept that is sort of central to how I move through the work that I do, but that I think will also help to frame this talk, and that is the idea of archival silencing. By archival silencing, I mean the ways that archives fail to represent, preserve, or make accessible the voices and perspectives of certain communities, often those marginalized by systems of power. In Indigenous contexts, this silencing has been profound. The written archive in New England overwhelmingly reflects colonial viewpoints in land sales, legal documents, missionary reports. Native voices appear, but often in fragmented, mediated, or distorted form. And just as a little sort of personal aside, as a child growing up in Massachusetts, as I did even on my own homelands, I learned very little about Indigenous history in my classrooms, and decidedly not from a critical pedagogical approach. I have vivid memories, however, of Thanksgiving classroom pageants, where students, I remember doing this in like first and second grade, would choose to dress as pilgrims or as Indians. And for many of us, that was the extent of Indigenous history in our curriculum. A week in November, a story about a meal. It wasn't until I became an adult and began working in special collections when I had the ability and agency to seek and find the stories of my ancestors reflected in primary documents that I could, at that time, begin sort of piecing together the complex histories beyond what the dominant narrative was feeding to me. These were stories of resilience, negotiation, and survival, but also of silencing, erasure, and dispossession. And I posit here on the slide that this archival silencing, again, is an active process, and it replicates itself in institutional spaces across sort of multiple stages. So I talk about the creation of records is where silencing can happen. People who are making them have particular biases. The collection of records, people who are deciding what gets collected and what does not, are participating in silences and making choices. The description and access to the records are another process by which we lose Indigenous voice. And then the use and interpretation, sort of the end result of all of this foundational library and archival work, again, can practice this silencing depending on how we contextualize and understand and sort of indigenize our research processes. So when I speak about archival silencing, I mean both what is left out and what was included in ways that distort and diminish Indigenous presence. The acknowledgement of the non-neutrality of archives is a call for everyone to work to recognize different modes of deception. And as I'll show today, many of the documents we rely on to understand land history in Southern New England are themselves instruments of that silencing. So let me just give you one example where I see this happen a lot. I think we've all probably heard the phrase, and the rest is history, when we're talking about all different sorts of things, right? But what does it mean when that phrase is applied to the history of the founding of a New England town, for example? And usually it means this. Settlers arrived, they purchased land, the native people faded away, and the town's history moves forward from there. This narrative assumes that Indigenous displacement was inevitable and complete. It leaves no room to interrogate the processes, the warfare, coercion, manipulation, or arbitrary imposition of foreign legal systems that made that displacement happen. But the reality is that Indigenous communities were actively removed. Native presence did not vanish naturally, it was targeted. Through epidemic disease, yes, but also through war, internment, forced cultural assimilation, and above all, this systematic dispossession of land. And so I just have this article here, which I stumbled upon in, I guess 2022 or so, but it's published in 2017, and it has stuck with me for a long time, specifically because this article is using a land deed for Bridgewater, and also using this turn of phrase to all at once sort of relegate Native people to the past and glorify what may actually be a troubling history of the settlement of the town, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for us to think through that. So turning to land deeds specifically, which is a particular kind of document that I'm really engaged with lately. For many Native nations, land was understood in terms of stewardship, reciprocity, and seasonal use. Land was cared for in common, with rights of access shifting across families and communities depending on the season and resources. The English, by contrast, imposed a legal system in which a deed signified exclusive, perpetual ownership, often for a specific individual. This cultural mismatch was often exploited. What Native leaders may have understood as an agreement to share access or permit limited use, colonists treated as an absolute cessation of rights, a cession of rights. Once recorded in colonial title registries, these deeds legitimized settler claims and erased Indigenous presence. Place names were, Algonquian language place names were replaced or disappeared, rights to hunt, fish, and gather were extinguished, and sovereignty was undermined. As historian Jean O'Brien has shown, these documents become foundational, these documents and how they're contextualized in the dominant culture, become foundational to the colonial invention of ownership of land in New England. They embedded dispossession not only in the landscape, but also in the archive and in law and in the narrative telling of the history of colonial New England. So colonial deed making began almost immediately upon the arrival of English settlers to the Dawnland. One early example comes from January 1642, when Narragansett leaders Miantinomi and Pomham deeded land from, I have a little quote here, the west side of that part of the sea called Soans Bay, from Kapasin-Atuxet over against a little island in the said bay, being the north bounds and the outmost point of that neck of land called Chalmette. Today, this place is called Warwick, Rhode Island, and this deed was transacted in exchange for 140 fathoms of land. And to put that exchange in perspective, a fathom of wampum was roughly maybe 6 feet long, or the span of someone's arm length. Strings of wampum would be bundled, made from quahog shells, would be bundled and counted in this way. And this is essentially a native technology that colonists appropriated as a kind of currency at the time. But the meaning of wampum for native communities was never purely economic. It was relational, ceremonial, and recorded agreements. Today, in our capitalist society, wampum at sort of a monetary federal level has no recognized monetary value. In 1642, however, it was enough to transfer large tracts of land. Afterwards, settlers would often and sometimes quickly parcel off that land and resell those tracts for real money, real currency, profiting many times over. In 1668, Metacom, known to the English later as Philip, would sign what is today referred to as a quitclaim for a section of land 8 miles square in what is referred to as, in the deed, quote, Seekonk, alias Rehoboth. And that area of southern New England gets sort of broken up to become separate towns of Rehoboth and Seekonk. This deed describes Metacom as affirming the transfer of this land to settlers John Brown and Edward Winslow in the spirit of the, quote, good and valuable considerations made previously by his father Usamiquin, the Massasoit, who had died 7 years earlier. So essentially they're asking Metacom to affirm, your dad really wanted us to have this. Can you just sign this over to us? Metacom, or Philip, whose signature you can see here, it says the mark of Philip Sachem, signs this deed less than 10 years before the war, often called King Philip's War, named for him, would begin. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the war, and just found this kind of rather benign map that felt nicer than showing like a violent image or something. But there's no really great map I found. But this one at least shows sort of the path and different engagements during the war. So King Philip's War, as many of us on the call might already know, especially if we've been attending this talk series this season, would know that the war is the deadliest conflict per capita in American history. Beginning in 1675, it pitted Indigenous nations, including the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Narragansett, against English colonists who across nearly all of southern New England and in some cases into parts of New Hampshire and Maine. Native leaders, including Metacom, sought to defend homelands against expanding settlements and the continued undermining of Indigenous sovereignty. Colonizers responded with scorched earth campaigns targeting both warriors and non-combatants. And apologies for using sort of military terminology, but that works here. The results were catastrophic. Villages were destroyed. Thousands of Native people were killed, enslaved, or displaced. Those who survived often faced internment or forced relocation. I mentioned enslavement. For Indigenous sovereignty in southern New England, King Philip's War marked a devastating turning point. And in addition to the Great Swamp Massacre that occurred in Narragansett Territory in December of 1675, another of the most harrowing episodes of the war occurred at Deer Island in Boston Harbor. In 1675, the Massachusetts General Court ordered hundreds of praying Indians, Christian converts from towns like Natick, many of whom had already pledged their allegiance to the English in the war, to be removed from their homes and confined on the island. Officials claimed that it was for protection, but the reality was natives were first forced away from their homes, transported to the island, and fully abandoned there. And by this point, the island was clear cut, so not a lot of wood or shelter or anything. And through the brutal winter of 1675 to 76, men and women, including elders and also children, suffered starvation, exposure, and disease. Many died. Estimates are in the hundreds. Those who survived returned to find their towns diminished, their lands sold off, and their communities fractured. And so I've just included on the slide here, there's memorial signage today at Deer Island and a bench that like memorializes Nipmuc lives lost at Deer Island. And then I also have a picture of a recent visit I made to the island. Deer Island was not only a site of suffering, it was a tool of land dispossession. By severing Native people from their homelands and undermining their capacity for self-sufficiency, colonial authorities cleared the way for English expansion. One of the people caught up in the sort of Deer Island issue was Wabun. A Nipmuc leader remembered first Christian Indian convert in John Eliot's missionary project enacted across Massachusetts during the second half of the 17th century. Despite Wabun's loyalty to the English and his role in founding Natick as a praying town, Wabun and his family were sent to Deer Island during the war. He survived, unlike many others, and returned to Natick, but the community never recovered. Later in 1682, Wabun and other Native leaders signed a deed transferring over 2,000 acres in what is now Sherborne, Massachusetts, for just 25 pounds. I tried to do some like currency inflation analysis, and maybe that's $3 per acre in today's money. And I a copy of the deed signed by Wabun, whose mark is at the top, and then several other Christian or converted Native people living in that area, which is sort of near Framingham, Massachusetts. And I've seen a lot of deeds like this enacted before, during, and after the war that transferred land for real money or wampum, as I mentioned, but also in exchange for market goods like 40 coats or cloth or animal pelts. A one-time exchange of those market goods for land that would generate wealth for those individual settlers in perpetuity. As Lumbee scholar Carrie Lowry Schultz points out in her book Indian Card, which I've been reading and rereading quite a lot for the work that she does on land dispossession, She writes, for the average American family, their home and the land it's on today are the source of most of their wealth. In many cases, this wealth was directly tied, as we can see, to the systematic removal of Indigenous people from there. Documents like this one, signed by Wabin, illustrate a certain post-war dynamic as well. Some Native leaders, often either Christian converts or those positioned by colonial authorities to lead various communities, after those communities were decimated by war, and whether or not their communities agreed to their leadership, were empowered by colonial authorities to transact massive land sales. These sales further chipped away at Native homelands, often without full community consent. This is evidenced by other deeds I've come across and petitions that appear in the archive, where tribal leaders appear in court to contest previous land sales enacted by other members of their communities. But again, dispossession did not end with the war or even immediately thereafter. Here we see some pictograph signatures by Native folks, including Bomazine, a leader at Norridgewock, in what is now Maine, Wabanaki territory, on this copy of the 1693 Treaty of Pemaquid. The treaty represented a renewal of an earlier treaty, the 1678 at Casco Bay, meant to maintain good relationships between Wabanaki tribes in what is now Maine and English settlers around the time sort of the French and Indians War. The document outlines the terms of a 20-day truce between the two parties, including a, quote, cessation of arms, an exchange of captives, and a reconvening of parties in 20 days' time. Treaties like the 1693 Treaty of Pemaquid attempted to establish peace between Wabanaki nations and the English in Maine, but such agreements were fragile, often undermined by French and English interference. Meanwhile, and despite treaty agreements, colonial governments issued dozens of proclamations sanctioning violence against Native peoples in Wabanaki homelands. French, English, and Wabanaki relationships in northern New England and in what was then considered the Massachusetts Bay Colony remained tenuous for nearly the next 100 years after the signing of those 17th century treaties, including the Treaty of Pemaquid. During this period, no fewer than 80 official proclamations or laws were issued by colonial governments and settlers in Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and as far as Nova Scotia that sanctioned the killing of Indigenous peoples. One such proclamation, issued in 1755, is known as the Phipps Proclamation. And this is where I'm going to very explicitly give a content warning. I'll echo here the guidance that I encountered on the Massachusetts Historical Society's website when I went to visit the digitized copy of this document to plop it into my slideshow. And the Mass Historical Society encourages people to, quote, be advised that this item contains racist and dehumanizing language and descriptions of violence. So I'm actually not I tried to sort of obscure the view of the document on the next slide. And as I said, it's available to view on your own through the Mass Historical Society's website. But I will read part of the text. So again, this is an official proclamation from 1755 issued by then Governor Spencer Phipps of Massachusetts Bay Colony. As part of the reaction to French and Wabanaki raids on British settlements in what was then Massachusetts Bay Colony, the proclamation states, quote, whereas the tribe of Penobscot Indians have repeatedly and in a perfidious manner acted contrary to their solemn submission unto His Majesty, it goes on to say, I declare the Penobscot tribe of Indians to be enemies, rebels, and traitors to His Majesty King George II. And I do hereby require His Majesty's subjects of this province to embrace all opportunities of pursuing, captivating, killing, and destroying all and every of the aforesaid Indians. In 1755, end quote. In 1755, the Phipps Proclamation declared the Penobscot Nation enemies of the Crown and offered bounties, literal prices attached, for the lives of not only men, but also prices for children and women. Settlers could literally exchange native lives or scalps for cash or land, and that's exactly what happened. Several towns in Massachusetts were established thereafter as what people are now calling bounty towns. Land handed over to settlers by the government, literally for the price of lives. This also in Maine, there are towns and allotments made for people who participated in the Great Swamp Massacre in Narragansett territory as well. So land passed into colonial hands not only through paper deeds, but also through warfare, internment, and outright state-sanctioned murder. So too, in the 18th century, land loss continued along sort of all these parallel processes in southern New England. One of the most consequential land transactions in Nipmuc history, in the history of my community, occurred in 1727, at a time when the Hassanamisco community was left residing on about 8,000 acres of their ancestral lands. And so I've included sort of an allotment or a parcel map of where land was carved up in this area by English authorities for Nipmuc people to live on. So they're living on about 8,000 acres of land. In 1727, 40 English settlers purchased 7,500 acres for the price of 2,500 pounds, founding the town of Grafton, Massachusetts, on what had been Nipmuc territory and leaving just 500 acres to the remaining families. Soon after, in 1746, Massachusetts imposed a state-mandated guardianship system that placed Nipmuc and other Massachusetts Native peoples under the control of white guardians who appointed themselves managers of Nipmuc land and debts, often through and evidenced in the archive by mismanagement, exploitation, and in some cases outright theft. At Hassanamisco, this system locked families into cycles of debt that forced the sale of their remaining land to cover legal fees, medical bills, or elder care expenses. And these, again, are costs generated by colonial systems that eroded Indigenous community structures. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I have an image from like an account book from the 1740s of sort of annuities or monies being paid to Nipmuc people who were allotted land, but also sort of debts that they incur and expenses that they have to pay based on infrastructure care that the guardians or the trustees are providing at these sort of what are essentially reservation spaces. So Nipmuc elders living at Hassanamisco, for example, might incur a medical care debt, a debt again imposed by English paternalistic systems that required Native peoples whose communities were otherwise dwindling for reasons of removal, forced assimilation, and the violence of war, to seek medical care not in their own communities, but in English households. And then if an elder died in an English household, for example, their children may have to forfeit their only asset, their land, to settle the debt. Through these mechanisms, Nipmuc landholding was steadily reduced, leaving many families landless within a few generations. But when we return to the deeds themselves, we can also see, hopefully, a little more than just dispossession. We see Native place names, places like Assabet, Shawmut, Menotomy, Wequamps. I've learned and researched quite a lot of them upon seeing them in many of these primary records that I've encountered. We also see kinship ties illustrated and community affiliations written down and described. We also see pictographs, marks that signers used and chose to represent themselves in place of written signatures, which sort of deals with the problem of literacy. So these marks, for me, are powerful. They remind us that Indigenous ancestors were present, that they engaged these moments with intentionality. Some marks are consistent over time, others change. I see them as acts of representation, even resistance. And so I've included on the slide little snapshots of pictograph marks that I found across various land deeds that are enacted across, I guess most of these are particularly for southern Massachusetts, southern New England. And I am just a little shameless plug to connect them to a social media project that I'm working on, where mostly weekly I try to share a pictograph, a name of the person, anything that I can glean from the documents themselves that includes place names or kinship relationships. In a lot of cases, in some cases, we might recognize the names of certain people who have signed documents, but in other cases, and for me, a lot of these names were not ones that I knew, or were not people whose lives I was taught of. So it feels like a real evocative project for me when it comes to sort of reawakening the stories and the lived experiences of ancestors. For example, imagine you're in the room about to sign a deed, meeting at the table in the 17th century. Whether the native or the settler, you're sat across the table from someone who may not speak the same language as you, not even a little bit. You have to trust a translator or interpreter, maybe someone you know, maybe someone you've never met before, to help illustrate for you a concept that is culturally inexplicable to you. And this could be true for folks on either side of the table, native or settler alike. Sometimes neither the grantor nor the grantee are literate. What does trust look like in that moment? I also think about whether these ancestors could have imagined that 350 years later, a Nipmuc librarian would study their marks in the archive. Perhaps they weren't thinking about that. But their presence on the page, for me, represents a form of survivance. And survivance is a term coined by Gerald Visner, who describes it as the active presence, ongoing resistance, and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples against forces of assimilation and colonial erasure. By studying these deeds critically, by looking not just at what was written, but at the silences or silencing, the place names, the pictographs, we can reawaken connections, honor ancestors, and use these histories to imagine futures of justice, even land return. Archival silencing is not simply an accident of history. In Indigenous context, it's the direct result of settler colonial systems that privileged written, Eurocentric forms of record keeping while dismissing Indigenous ways of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Institutions prioritize materials that reflect settler governance, property, and authority. Oral histories, ceremonial knowledge, and community-held practices, which are core forms of Indigenous memory, were not deemed legitimate, quote, archives, and thus excluded. But this calls me as an Indigenous librarian to seek to understand this in ways that allow me to use the archives to bring those stories forth once again, and do better to connect them with traditional knowledge and practice. This practice of silencing serves to uphold the societal belief that Indigenous people not only are no longer here, but don't maintain a right to their homelands. And land dispossession is not a thing of the past, as I hopefully will demonstrate in a moment. It's current and ongoing. And so it's important to recognize that dispossession did not end in the 17th or 18th centuries. And it is in fact foundational to later policies enacted in America. I think a lot about these forms of land dispossession enacted in southern New England and their connections to the Dawes Act or Indian removal or the Homestead Act or Manifest Destiny overall. And in Indigenous cultures, land is inextricable from cultural identity. In Rhode Island, coastal lands once central to Indigenous lifeways are now fenced off by private homes, often used only in summer by out-of-staters. Access to the ocean, once a given, is now a privilege. This article from 2021 relates to the systematic exclusion of Narragansett tribal members from the Rhode Island coastline. A quote from the article reads, quote, "As the years go by, more and more of their ancestral Narragansett land is walled off, and tribal members progressively have to pay more to access their ancient spiritual grounds, the coast and the ocean," end quote. The article goes on to say that the state's coastal waters also suffer from pollution, from stormwater runoff, ineffective cesspools, failing septic systems, and combined sewer overflows, end quote. A disregard for the necessary Indigenous forms of care and stewardship that have become so urgent in this time of climate crisis. In Boston Harbor, Deer Island is now the site of a wastewater treatment plant. In 2018, then Boston Mayor Marty Walsh proposed a $92 million project to reconstruct a bridge to connect islands in Boston Harbor and create a drug treatment center on Long Island, an issue hotly contested by the city of Quincy. These plans to redevelop nearby islands rarely acknowledge the role of Native internment there. However, Native communities remember through annual paddles, ceremonially navigating away from Deer Island and down the Quinnipiac or Charles River and back to Natick, symbolically bringing ancestors back to their home places there. In Plymouth, the Herring Pond Wampanoag have been resisting a massive construction project threatening burial sites and sacred landscapes. Chairwoman Melissa Ferretti has rightly called it both a cultural and ecological. These examples remind us land dispossession and the colonial construct of land ownership is not history, it's ongoing. Which of course brings me to the land back movement. Land back is about the return of land, yes, but also the return of sovereignty, the honoring of treaties, and the restoration of Indigenous stewardship practices. Though the push for land back is not new, it's in fact centuries old at this point, land back as a hashtag on social media has gained momentum over the last 2 decades. It's not only synonymous with land return and the reassertion of sovereignty, but is tied to frontline environmental activism happening across Turtle Island, or North America, as Native and Indigenous nations resist dangerous and disruptive mining projects, pipelines, and other ecological threats to land and water. As a librarian and curator, I see my role as connected to a critical engagement with the archives and the work of actively archiving what is happening today as a result of the centuries of dispossession captured in the paper trail of documents. It becomes critical to use archives not only to document the mechanisms of dispossession, but also to reconnect communities with ancestral knowledge, place names, and stories. To resist silencing by making Indigenous voices heard again, and by pushing institutions to acknowledge their complicity and change their practices. Again, archives are not neutral, and silencing in the archive has upheld the belief that Indigenous peoples are gone, that our rights to our homelands have vanished, that the rest is history. But by reading the silences critically, by attending to the marks, the place names, and the lived experiences behind the documents, we resist. Land dispossession is not the past, it's ongoing. And the work of land back, whether through legal means, activism, or cultural revitalization, is about insisting on Indigenous presence, sovereignty, and stewardship in the present and into the future. Kadabadamish, thank you. That's it.
So from David Powers, I thought Metacom came to Springfield for the incursion on that town, though the map does not show him traveling there.
Yeah, I think there is a lot that happened in the war that wasn't represented in that map. I kind of just pulled it from the internet. Again, I mentioned a lot of people, when they talk about King Philip's War, they might share like violent images, and I tried to find something that was like soft. So I'm sure there was a lot missing. It wasn't a particularly scholarly engaged map. There's a lot missing there.
Thank you. Barbara Wolfinger says, when did the Native Americans realize they had different definitions of owning lands?
I think that's a really wonderful question. And there's probably multiple answers to this. I'm certainly not an authority by any means on a lot of the things I tried to touch on today. But I think in the lead up to King Philip's War, for example, it started to become very clear that there was a lot of dissonance, a lot of cultural dissonance between settlers and Native folks. There's been scholarship on this. But I guess in terms of like reading more about the war, you start to understand that even Metacom, who petitioned the colonial government in Massachusetts for an English name, might be doing so to kind of signal that he recognizes that English settlers move very differently from Indigenous peoples. So there are like sort of things that I think when you pair traditional or cultural knowledge and ways of being with how people are engaging at sort of like a colonial governmental level, that there's a recognition through pretty early on, like 1650s, 60s or so, that people are starting to understand things are different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kamala asks, what were the name of some of the bounty towns in Massachusetts and Maine? She put in question marks.
Yeah, interesting that the proclamation is dealing mostly with Wabanaki communities in what becomes Maine, but most of the land from what research I've done and what I've learned from people, is granted in southern Massachusetts, specifically in southern New England, specifically Massachusetts. Petersham, Massachusetts can be considered a bounty town. Spencer, Massachusetts, Leiden in western Massachusetts has some connections to bounties, and so essentially the earliest settlers, English settlers to those towns, are people who traded or received instead of money, land for the bounty taking that they did. There's some work. There's actually a documentary film called Bounty by the Upstander Project that you can access if you want to learn more about that.
Thank you for that. I've been trying to write down some of your book recommendations and things as you went along too. So, okay, Sarah asked, is your social media project with pictographs and names on Instagram? And if so, how can we find it?
Yeah, it is on Instagram and Tumblr. It's called Their Marks. I put it in the chat.
Oh, yeah. It looks like someone did put it in there as well.
Oh, yeah. People, thank you for adding links.
I love people who are techie and they can do that stuff quick. That's why Wampanoag has a tech person who handles all that for us. So another question, can it be confirmed that Narragansett Indian tribal members now have free access to Narragansett town beaches? I believe there was an outcry about this around 2022.
I don't know that I'm the best person here as someone who's not a Narragansett person. I don't know the ins and outs of that. Maybe Chrystal, you do.
Yeah, so as a Narragansett citizen, we do not have free access. That was, from my understanding, for that 1 year, and then you had to request access again. So it was 1 year in one Narragansett town beach, is my understanding. And then that's something that you have to put application in for another year. But there may be others who will watch and listen to this who could be more specific about that, the details of that agreement. In a very tangible way, how can deed holders in this area participate in land back movements? Are there local efforts to transfer land ownership back to tribal hands?
Yes. That's I appreciate that question. There's a lot of work, and I can speak from my context, like I will speak about my community and work that I've been involved in rather than speak on what Wampanoag or Narragansett folks are doing. But there are ways to engage with tribal governments and or nonprofits. There are many Indigenous-led nonprofits that are working toward land rescue or structures of land return, insofar as being able to transfer land. So there's the idea of land back and being a deed holder and returning your lands to the original stewards. Is a wonderful thing to do, but otherwise there are processes for creating like cultural easements or agreements with communities for rights of access to different places, or I don't know, all kinds of things you can outline in terms of cultural easements relative to like not only access but the ability to collect medicines or harvest or forage things on those lands. And so there are land trusts in Massachusetts and even state agencies in Massachusetts that have wonderful people working for and with them. Indigenous folks, I'm thinking about, there's Leah Hopkins, who is a Narragansett person who works with the department, DCR, Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts, to help these organizations understand their role and methods of accountability, but also to sort of work with community members to promote access or cultural use agreements or education about impacts and Native history. So I would always recommend for people to sort of seek out not only just any local land trust, because they might not be doing the engaged and informed work, but if you do more research, you can probably find on land trust websites in your area whether or not they're engaged with local community members. But even at a state level, at least in Massachusetts, there are people, Native and Indigenous people, empowered in particular roles to help people move through thinking about land return or use agreements and easements and things like that.
Thank you. Some thoughtful comments. Many thanks for the presentation. Awesome presentation. Very powerful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your scholarship. And when you speak of your ancestors, you honor them. Let me see if this is wonderful presentation and important work. Thank you for doing it and sharing it in a way that makes it understandable. Much gratitude. That was fantastic. Thank you. And here's a question. Can you speak to colonist efforts to resist the revocation of the Mass Bay Charter in 1684 by paying Indigenous people to affirm the lawful earlier sales of land?
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Can you speak to colonists' efforts to resist the revocation of the Mass Bay Charter in 1684 by paying Indigenous people to affirm the lawful earlier sales of land?
Yeah, so I think this is really getting at kind of those complexities and like cultural dissonances and the kind of, I talked a little bit about like the use and abuse of particular relationships and power structures. I talked a little bit about how after the war, Native people who were interred at Deer Island and suffered trauma there were returned to their communities. And I wonder a lot about the power dynamics therein and how they're being affirmed or not, or like how power is being wielded against them. So yeah, there's the settlers kind of scramble around this time to like prove, no, I do lawfully have this land. I've seen in documents too that there's a push to kind of record things very far after the fact on paper that are that like a settler, you can sort of glean that like I don't know. I sometimes imagine people in a room being like, no, this happened. I swear I have this person here to affirm it. We're just going to write it down. It's been 10 years, but I'm going to get it written down for you now and you can file it away and I'll be, so that's happening. And so I think it's a hard question for me to answer, again, as someone who's not like a super expert. I'm an information professional and I want to get the information to the people. But like examining and like unraveling all these threads of like the complexities around like what is the power dynamic between the two people that are showing up in a room to like affirm signatures, what has the person who's signing that document been through in the war? Who have they lost in their life? What is the agreement that they have that's not written down on paper about those things? But yeah, there's certainly a push for colonists to like affirm. And so even the like certain deeds, you see it with the deed that I showed of Philip signing that says like, well, his father really wanted us to have this, so we're just going to have him sign it and affirm what his dad said. And that happens later when colonists are worried that the crown will sort of revoke the charter and therefore they won't have legal claim to land because all of that stuff will be like negated after. I'm sorry if that's not a super clear answer to your question. It's just like your question is actually having me think about more questions and about this and ways to sort of mine the complex like personal agreements there. But I also think it has something to do with people being empowered to sign documents by colonial authorities that give them a particular power that they can exercise back in their own communities. I mentioned briefly that there are documents, people selling land, and then later Nipmuc community members come back and they say that person didn't actually have a right to sell that land on behalf of this community, and they will petition and say. So there's even like fraudulent acts happening within communities, like that sort of lateral violence that gets stoked and reified by these like power dynamics that are happening.
Yeah, when you had shared that, it made me think of a particular Narragansett sachem where that was the case in our own history.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard to go back and unpack that because we're not there at the time, obviously. And so now we're just trying to unpack what happened. And it's not our perspective, such as when you started out with this lunch and learn. These documents are not recorded in our perspective. Daisy asks, can you point me in the right direction to find out more about Deer Island and what happened there around the time of the war? Do you recommend any particular resources to look at?
Yeah, I've seen some questions in the chat too about resources for readings and things. I'm going to try to share my screen again because I did frantically 10 minutes before I jumped on the call throw a slide from another presentation in here as a selected bibliography. So there are hopefully some things that people can take away from this here. So also some of these, like Jean O'Brien, for example, I'm looking at the bibliography and realizing I copy pasted it over, but it's not super great. Christine DeLucia writes a book called Memory Lands, which deals with, you will find sort of connections to sort of how we remember and think of these places. And I think in terms of getting implementing a critical engagement with these histories that includes Indigenous perspectives, memory is a really good place to start with. Lisa Brooks's Our Beloved Kin is a great sort of new engagement with the histories of King Philip's War, which we'll talk about. Also an online resource connected to that book. That is sort of a nice entry point into thinking about and moving through landscape. But also, there are, of course, news articles recently that cover some of the people from my own community who have started and maintained the sort of Deer Island ceremony, the paddle, that like brings ancestors back home from Deer Island. So you can read about that. Yeah, I had something else just came and went through my brain. I might get it back in a second. Also like visiting Deer Island. It's sometimes it's something to go to these places and experience them and understand them as real landscapes that other people before you have encountered. But there is that memorial there, which I guess I hope helps people to think about what happened in that place too. I always encourage people to like be on the land and the landscape too when you're thinking about learning or self-educating about these histories.
Thank you. I just want to make one correction. It is written in here that access to Narragansett Beach is still available to Narragansett tribal members with a tribal ID. So I just want to point that out. Those of you who are still on here had question. It's answering that, what we asked earlier. Can you speak to the Roger Williams settlement, which supposedly began as mutually agreed upon?
Yeah. So there, I feel like it will be really reductive if I talk about it because I'm not necessarily like a Roger Williams scholar. But Roger Williams having been kind of asked to leave Massachusetts Bay Colony, I guess the history is that it was sort of agreed that he could come occupy space in what is to become Rhode Island and live sort of in a place that was like between Wampanoag and Narragansett sort of meeting places, and that would be a fine place for him to be. So I suppose like very reductively, that was sort of how it started. But again, as someone who's not Wampanoag or I'm a little bit Narragansett, Chrystal. I have some Narragansett ancestry, but I'm not enrolled in the community there. I like would want to hear more from like Narragansett and Wampanoag people about sort of the agreements and the community memory of what that agreement was. But I think history frames it as like at the start it was like, sure, you can hang out over here. We're going to be over here this season anyway, so you can kind of grew to whatever kind of relationship building went from there. But Roger Williams, though very much sort of glorified and thought of as a white founder of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, was a problematic figure, someone who enslaved people, someone who did a lot of like ethnographic study of Narragansett people in ways that has helped to he did capture like cultural experiences and language and things that I think are useful in certain ways, but also did a lot to disempower and disenfranchise Narragansett people. So he's a problematic figure, although maybe the engagement as Native people, as a Nipmuc person, culturally, we're meant to welcome people and help people who come to us, but that doesn't always shake out in the best of ways. I don't know.
I'm sorry. I just put a suggestion. So Max Scott is a Narragansett citizen and also a historian and works with Brown University. You can look him up. He's done many talks and papers on the Rhode Island founding and the relationship with Roger Williams, and actually speaks to that question. So I just encourage you to look up some of his works as well, or any of his YouTube that he's done through Tamaquag or otherwise. It is my understanding correct, that although Metacom signed some documents sharing land with the English in Plymouth County, he did not do so for the Mount Hope Peninsula before the rebellion, King Philip's War, and that afterward, with the okay of the English king, the peninsula was transferred to the colonists and then sold to English investors, despite any leftover claim that Metacom's people might have claimed.
Okay. So there are documents in the archive, right, that also show not Metacom, but his brother, who comes to be known as Alexander, or Wamsutta, and their father, Hassanamisco, did a lot to try to navigate this sort of deed-making process while also clarifying that they were not necessarily in charge of other tribal areas. There are some documents. There's one document at the Massachusetts Historical Society, for example, where Hassanamisco and Wamsutta are saying, you have to ask Weetamoo about that land because we don't govern there. Our cousin is governing in that space, and you have to go to that person. So I can see that sort of coming through in the thread of this question. But that there are ways that the sort of historicizing of different figures puts them in these places, right? Like we called him Massasoit and knew him to like sort of govern across all of these different spaces. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in practice, as a real person in the world, that he even himself said, like, I don't have authority in that place. I can't sign that. You have to go talk to her. So even though like history and patriarchy wants us to believe like this one man was in charge of everything, there are other ways of being and ways that person actually moved in the world that meant that they were not in charge of all of those places. But because of degrees of like mediation and dispossession and sort of this power dynamic that hopefully I articulated a little bit in the talk, this is what happens, right? Like especially like scrambling to make sure that you have authority, that you can get this person who you say is the sachem here, whether or not their community consents to that person being the sachem, to sign this paper that then lets you sell and parcel and resell the land, is kind of where the waters get super muddy over time. I hope that wasn't a non-answer, but just sort of trying to complicate a little bit.
Not at all. We're actually just about at time. I know there are other questions. This has really been a powerful presentation, Kimberly, and obviously so many questions that pop up. I don't know if you want to share your email, if you want to take questions after, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today, and all of you who took time out during your lunch to join us, Tamaquag Museum, for this presentation. The session has been recorded, and it will be available on Tamaquag's YouTube page, and I believe on that page also you can get the there might be an opportunity to get the transcript or whatever for some of the answers to some of these questions in the coming weeks. So feel free to revisit it, or share it with others. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and we do invite you back next month on October 27th for another Lunch and Learn. Our guest speaker that day will be Akia de Barros Gomez as she presents Forging Freedom. What did freedom look like for Indigenous and African enslaved peoples around the time of the Declaration? So we ask that you stay connected. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Visit our website for updates on this series and other upcoming programs. We hope you all have a wonderful day. Peace Kanash.
Thank you, everybody.